Hello, everyone. My name is Rich Longo, Flycast Partners, and I'll be your host for today's presentation. Thank you for joining us for Data Loss Prevention presented by Brian Reed of Proofpoint. Now, Brian has over 20 plus years in the IT security space and has worked in a variety of product development, system engineering, business development, and sales roles. Before joining Proofpoint, he was a senior director and analyst for Gartner. His specialty is in security strategy, risk and security management programs, security awareness, and insider threat management. Before we get started, let me introduce Flycast Partners. Flycast Partners offers best-in-class implementation services and training in IT service management, IT asset management, IT operations management, IT security, enterprise service management, and workload automation spaces using ITIL best practice. Our professional services team has well over 5,600 professional service engagements on site and remote. And as an organization, Flycast Partners has well over 1,200 regular customers throughout Canada and the United States that keep coming back over and over again. I encourage you to reach out to us at 844-FLYCAST, that's 844-359-2278, or visit our website and chat with us live Monday through Friday from 8:30 a.m. until 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time, or email us at info@flycastpartners.com. Now, without further delay, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to none other than Brian Reed.
Great. Thanks, Rich. I'm going to jump in and talk about data loss prevention. But before we get started, let's take a little bit of a look back in time. And this isn't a surprise to anybody on the call today, but 2020 could really be summed up as the work from anywhere, data is everywhere year. And that really seemed to be the case almost a year ago today, or a little over a year ago today. Many of us went pretty much remote for the most part. High 90% of organizations had remote people that were not centralized in offices anymore because of the fear and the spread of the pandemic and some very real global pandemic concerns, of course. With that being said, we had to make a number of different changes to our security posture. We had to open up access to applications and data so that businesses and organizations could continue to function with at least some semblance of normalcy. That might have required a lot of very quick changes. I hope at some point during the second half of 2020, many of you went through and did some reviews of what your organization's posture was with regards to accessing information from potentially anywhere. And looking into the future, there needs to be a fundamental shift in how we approach cybersecurity strategy. So most defenders and people in IT have traditionally operated with this network-centric point of view. This is really summarized in the defender's point of view on the slide here on the left. And we thought about security in terms of IP addresses and ports and segmentation in VLAN strategy. When you want to protect something on your network, like a server or a database or a device, you typically put a firewall or an intrusion detection, intrusion prevention system in front of it. You might have done some form of VLAN segmentation, or you might have controlled access to that system directly through something like firewall ACLs or a VPN. The adoption of cloud apps and platforms, specifically Office 365 and others, challenged the network-centric approach because it made it difficult to really gain visibility into all types of threats that affected your people. Threats in the cloud may never traverse your on-premises network. And also, there was some difficulty in prioritizing alerts and incidents according to the relative risk of your organization. So something that might look risky to one organization might be normal operating behavior to another. And if we look at the world today, attackers can easily use things like open source intelligence through LinkedIn or Google and launch a targeted attack against people. So defenders are no longer focused on trying to use exploits as much against some of the infrastructure in your environment, particularly since in many cases, your people aren't using the infrastructure in your environment today or have been using it in a limited basis for the last year. Makes a lot more sense to go after where the crown jewels actually are, where that application and data access is happening, and it's happening with the people. To further highlight on this, attackers were especially at home in the cloud. And many people have the running joke of in 2020, what was the biggest business enabler of digital transformation? Was it your CIO? Was it your CISO? Or was it COVID-19? And with that move to digital transformation and moving to applications and data in the cloud, specifically things like Office 365, the cloud platform itself and the cloud application itself, in many cases, became the launching pad for attacks and threats into your own environment. Just looking across the Proofpoint customer base, we saw right around 60 million malicious messages that were targeted at Proofpoint customers and either sent or hosted by Office 365 in 2020. A little over 93% of our organizations were targeted. So 93% of our install base was targeted by some form of attack coming from Office 365. And what's also interesting is 1 in 5 organizations have had some sort of malicious OAuth application. So particularly with the rise of working from anywhere and data is everywhere and the need to have applications and services support that, we've seen a rise in third-party access and third-party applications, particularly cloud applications that have sprung up out of this desire to be able to keep the business moving, keep our organization doing what it needs to do as part of our normal and everyday lives. At Proofpoint, our viewpoint on information security and data protection is simple. The notion around DLP, data loss prevention, is a market term that's been around for a long time. But as we all know, data doesn't inherently lose itself. Data doesn't just grow legs and walk out of your organization on its own. It's typically driven by some form of user action or some form of broken business process. And as we know, those broken business processes like automation rules and tasks and things like that are ultimately driven by users. So data is in lots of places it's supposed to be. It gets lots of places it's not supposed to be, but it doesn't get there by itself. It gets to where it's not supposed to be by some sort of human involvement. And that person may be a negligent or careless or accidental user. They might not know what they're doing. They might not have the proper awareness or education, or you might not have a culture of people asking questions about, hey, I'm going to make this decision with data or with an application. Should I be doing this? People might just sort of make those decisions. And the old adage of asking forgiveness instead of permission comes to mind here. You might have users that are truly compromised. Maybe they clicked on a credential phishing link and offered up their credentials to Office 365 via a spoofed page. Maybe they're a victim of overall account takeover. Or some sort of business email compromise has socially engineered that user. And that user or somebody might be taking action where it looks like that it's that user, but it's really a threat actor doing those things. And then the minority case, but this certainly happens, there are truly malicious user actions out there. There are users that might be looking to steal information internally. You might have employees that are leaving the organization or contractors or third parties where that business agreement has run its course and is ending. They might be doing things like harvesting information, looking to stage and exfiltrate that information out there. And the spectrum of human risk and user risk, again, I talked about negligent, compromised, and malicious users. These are just some examples of the types of use cases out there and the types of data activity that they might be doing and the intent behind it. So some examples here, I know many organizations, those of you specifically that have had a DLP program for a number of years or a certain amount of time, certainly have some user risk cases built around things like regulatory compliance and intellectual property protection, and trying to govern how data is moving around and monitoring and making sure that we have visibility for it at different places in the environment. If we look at Proofpoint's approach to threat and information protection, our threat and information protection platform is really a two-pronged approach. And the idea here is that we want to protect people from the threats that are targeting them. We have an understanding of user risk. We know that there are certain users out there that are just simply accidental or careless or negligent. We know that there's some users that run the risk, particularly our very attacked people, of being compromised or their accounts taken over. And then we know that there are truly malicious people out there, but we want to be able to protect people ultimately from the threats targeting them over the common methods of threat propagation that happen out there. Typically, I covered this in a previous presentation, about 96% of all threats come from email. So obviously email is that number one threat vector, but we also have the rise of things like people mailing Dropbox links around and unsanctioned cloud applications. And we also want to make sure that ties in with some of the other things going on in your environment. Are we seeing certain types of threats at the network and the endpoint? Do we need to correlate those together to get a better understanding of what our threat profile looks like? And then we ultimately, along with protecting people from the threats, we want to protect the information that people are ultimately creating and accessing. That information typically starts with being created or modified or changed at the endpoint, but that information is typically sent via email or cloud application or stored via those means. So we need to have coverage for not just what's going on an endpoint, not just what's going on in a data repository, but we need to have that complete visibility of movement. And that's really what we get into with looking at mapping this up very loosely to something like the NIST cybersecurity framework of protecting, responding, and predicting actions. We need to be able to not just do the blocking and tackling, but we need to understand and profile that information protection risk. Looking at the Proofpoint platform itself, we call these our 3 pillars of information protection. So again, looking across email, we have our email data loss prevention capabilities. Cloud, we have our Proofpoint Cloud Access Security Broker. And then our endpoint, we actually take a 2-prong approach here. We have both our endpoint data loss prevention agent and our insider threat management capabilities. So this is actually the same agent, and it's simply a licensing change to perform these 2 activities. And we'll get into this in a little bit more detail in a moment. There's also some additional add-ons here to the information protection platform. So really those 3 pillars of the table being email DLP, CASB, and endpoint. We also have a number of capabilities that help support that. And the idea is to increase that level of cross-channel visibility, cross-channel threat context, and really help to unify our alerting and our incident management and our investigation. So one of the primary goals of our information protection platform is to help gain faster visibility and speed up those incident response investigations related to traditional DLP problems. We do that through looking at things like infrastructure as a service, so IaaS protection for some of the common cloud infrastructure that you might be using, like AWS and Azure. We also have SaaS isolation capabilities, so that that scenario where somebody gets a credential phish where it's a fake link to log into Office 365, even on an unmanaged system, we could detect that activity and put them into a browser isolation where we're protecting that user from anything malicious. We also have our Proofpoint Data Discover product, which covers file server data at rest, so scanning things like SharePoint and file share repositories. And then Proofpoint Meta is our approach to zero trust network access. So just like we no longer have to really focus as heavily on on-premises access, we might still have some scenarios where we want to have app-by-app control. We might want to have additional network protections based upon an application or based upon an access that we're making, and that's where Proofpoint Meta comes into play. One of the valuable points of the Proofpoint information platform, this is a view of our console and unified alert management. So in this screenshot, what's going on is there's a security operations person who is looking into investigating a specific user by the name of Carol Brown. And this screenshot's really powerful. There's a lot of things going on in here. But if we advance this, the big piece is really highlighting on the channels on the left. Being able to view cloud, email, and endpoint activities in a single view without needing to look at 3 different consoles or more to try to correlate and understand what's happening is really proof positive that we can speed up that time to investigation, which can ultimately result in faster time to contain and remediate incidents. And again, highlighting here the channels that are needed to inspect. Information protection is really more than content awareness. So if we look at the traditional DLP problem, data loss prevention used to actually be called the content-aware data loss prevention market. But as we can see, content awareness is really at best a third of the problem as it comes to DLP. There's certainly a need to go out and discover and understand and maybe even label or tag different types of information that you know of, so known content out there. You might be using something like Microsoft information protection tags to do this. It's also important to understand behavior. So just like I mentioned, content inspection is important, but also understanding the user activity, the intent, and the access context in which somebody is actually trying to view or change or manipulate or modify or transfer data is hugely important. Along with that, understanding threats. So is that user really who they say they are, or has their account been compromised? So content and behavior or context are important, but also applying a threat lens to this is incredibly important, because the first 2 around content and behavior really don't mean anything if that user isn't really who they say they are. If that user's been compromised or their account's been taken over, or if they suffered a credential phishing attack, it's really not that user taking those actions on data. It's somebody who's doing it on their behalf. And we need to understand that, particularly when you look at things like insider threat investigations. If you're not looking at the threat angle, you run the risk of potentially accusing somebody of something, and people could lose their jobs, their careers, their livelihood. It might look a certain way in a classic or legacy DLP system. It might look a certain way in a user behavior analytics console. But if you're not triangulating threat along with that to really dig in and say, is that user who they say they are? First of all, you're really not doing your job running an insider threat investigation or a DLP investigation program. But you also run the risk of falsely accusing somebody and opening up your organization to more problems. I mean, we all have numerous stories about things like false imprisonment and the like. The same thing is true in a digital sense here. Along that same vein of thought, one of the things that traditional data loss prevention programs really struggle with is who ultimately represents risk to your organization. As I mentioned, DLP for a long time was called the content-aware DLP market. And just by understanding content doesn't help you understand who might be vulnerable to threats, who are my people that are getting attacked, and what sort of privileges represent the most risk to my organization. So if we build this slide out a bit further, we can start figuring out what's the likelihood, what's the probability, and what's the ultimate impact to user-driven risk. And my very attacked people are sitting at the middle of this. So what you might have is a scenario where you might have users that are highly attacked and have a lot of privileges, but they've really locked themselves down from a threat standpoint, and they're very diligent. Conversely, you might have people who are very vulnerable and get attacked a lot, but they don't have a lot of privileges. They don't have administrative credentials on anything. They're not a particularly powerful user. We need to start looking at framing the user risk part of this as part of how we build out a valid information protection program and platform. This is another screenshot here of a product that's currently in beta from Proofpoint called Nexus People Risk Explorer, or NPRE. Again, I mentioned this is currently in beta. This will be released in calendar Q2 of 2021. This is currently running in beta on just under 200 organizations today, 200 of our customers at Proofpoint. And if you're a Proofpoint customer that currently has one of our bundles, you're probably going to be able to take advantage of this in the next quarter and see some inherent value and help you drill into understanding who are my risky people and what makes them so risky. And then you can also trend this over time. So some of the inputs that we're using today for our Nexus People Risk Explorer are our targeted attack protection from our email product. Our Proofpoint security awareness training also feeds into this because you can start looking at which users may be falling into that negligent or accidental case. You might have users out there who are delinquent in completing required security awareness training, or they haven't completed other modules that might help them be less risky. Also, our cloud security products, so things like our cloud account defense and our cloud access security broker feed into this, looking for things like people that might be using unsanctioned or unapproved third-party cloud applications and the like. So each of the three parts of our DLP and information protection strategy here at Proofpoint, I'm going to dig into a little bit further in the next 3 slides around content, behavior, and threats. Content awareness, what we do from a traditional inspecting and breaking into data and understanding the contents of that data, we do that over our email and our cloud security channel. And at the endpoint, we take advantage of that heavy inspection that we do at those network proxies. So the ability to be able to throw the power of compute at something when, let's say, you're uploading a file to SharePoint online, or downloading something from Box, or sending an attachment or receiving an attachment via email, using some of those classification detectors that we've had in our email product for a number of years. And one of the other things that we've done is we've unified our classification detectors across our email and our CASB channels to create that consistency there. And then from the endpoint, being able to not just look at what we've seen from an inspection standpoint over email and cloud, but also take advantage of things like Microsoft information protection tags and other sorts of smart ID metadata tagging that you might have done over email and cloud. We can see that on the endpoint and respect policies that are created there. Looking at user behaviors, again, the idea here is that we're augmenting both content and threat awareness. So we really have a single lightweight endpoint that runs in 2 modes. The first mode is a traditional DLP mode, a traditional endpoint DLP mode. And I've got a slide later on that'll go into more detail about the agent. And then the other mode can take on a full user activity monitoring. So this is really your endpoint insider threat management. So on the top, just your basic endpoint DLP is going to look for all of those different file-centric actions. So moves, copies, creates, executes, deletes, copying and writing to USB, uploading to cloud, even if there's no CASB there, seeing what's going on the endpoint. The full user activity monitoring is going to take this a step further. We're going to look for endpoint encryption that's happened to a specific file. We're going to look at installing things like hacking tools and steganography tools, and looking at a number of other behavioral conditions. So we have a few hundred threat scenarios in our library for our endpoint insider threat management that are already pre-built for you. So that you can use those and really speed up your time to deployment and success. And then threat awareness is where Proofpoint really separates from the pack. If you look at the classic things that we do in CASB or cloud and email to identify potentially compromised users or those likely to be compromised users, like your very attacked persons, because they're heavily targeted by attackers, we have incredibly convincing evidence that the user actually is compromised. You prioritize the DLP alert generated with this context much more highly than you would any other DLP alert. So that scenario I gave earlier, if you knew that user's account was taken over and that user was not really who they look like in the logs, you would certainly scale up the priority and or severity of that alert to put a extra focus on that. But that's really not what legacy DLP solutions were designed to do. The threat context really underscores the value of Proofpoint, and having not just cloud threat telemetry where we look for unusual login patterns and those cloud third-party app installations and file sharing activities, but also marrying that up with the email threat telemetry out there. Again, we covered email is the number one threat vector out there. So looking for malicious contents, persistent targeting, things like business email compromise campaigns, and looking at my very attacked persons metrics, triangulating this threat is what really makes the Proofpoint information platform so powerful. Now, Proofpoint's had our email DLP and encryption solutions for a decade and a half now, and they've really been optimized for a number of different use cases. In addition to content, email DLP also gives us some of those behavioral insights to what's going on over email, optimized for sending and receiving encrypted messages, really that seamless experience of sharing encrypted messages and being able to inspect for different types of content and standard DLP controls over email. On the Proofpoint cloud side, on the CASB side, there's really three pillars to the approach here. Cloud threat protection really goes in and looks for some of those cases of account takeover, particularly cloud account takeover, looking also at advanced malware protection that's powered by our targeted attack protection. Cloud data security is really where the tie into the information protection platform is the strongest. So going through and discovering cloud data at rest, sensitive data that's residing or uploaded, downloaded, moving around your different cloud applications, and unifying that with both the email and the on-premises endpoint channels. We also have our optional SaaS isolation to block there. Jumping into the endpoint, though, why would we distinguish between endpoint DLP and insider threat? So this is where I was mentioning just the base endpoint DLP earlier. If we build this out one click, the data activity is really a great way to think about this is your detection and response capabilities for DLP. This is your everyday use case, your file copies, your moves, your creates, your executables. Great for everyday use. People that are of normal or low risk, but still might be susceptible to some sort of unsanctioned or unapproved data movement, and really sort of your general solution at the endpoint. If we build this out a step further, though, the optional Proofpoint Insider Threat Management looks at all that data activity of endpoint DLP along with some additional user activities. So I mentioned the 400 plus threat scenarios. This is really a great solution for taking a subset of your users, particularly ones that you might want to put on some sort of watch list. These could be people that have given their notice and are looking to leave your organization. These could be suppliers or third parties. These could also be newcomers to your organization. So maybe you have people on a 30, 60, 90-day plan. When you onboard users, you might be putting them through security awareness training and a number of other IT-related onboarding tasks so they get familiar with the controls and the technologies in your environment. These are a great candidate to put through the full insider threat management. The great thing about this is being able to flip this with a license switch instead of needing to push down an additional agent or a heavy policy of some sort. It's not two separate agents. It's a single agent that's controlled by licensing to enable or change these capabilities as needed. If we drill into the endpoint DLP a little bit further, this is where we're a little bit unique from some of the other classic DLP endpoints out there in the world. We run as a lightweight user-based agent. We only turn on kernel mode actions for things that require kernel mode by the operating system. So things like USB file writing actions require kernel mode by everybody. Of course, we would use a kernel call to do that, but we don't always need to run in kernel mode. We can simply run in user mode and be more lightweight. And again, this diagram on the right, for those of you who are very familiar with endpoint detection and response or endpoint protection platforms, this build out of these steps in this timeline looks very familiar to what you would see from an EDR tool. So again, a great way to think about our endpoint DLP is really an EDR for data, delivering that contextual knowledge around the who, what, when, and where around these different data actions. Again, the insider threat management piece, same client as the endpoint DLP, exact same executable, but really it's configurable to look for a lot of other threat scenarios that we've included. So I mentioned 400 plus different threat scenarios that are pre-built into the product. So under the data exfiltration, these are common scenarios like connecting unsanctioned or unapproved USB devices, but even looking for things like file transfer via airdrop sharing on Mac OS, or opening up your cloud storage sync folder that might be mapped locally. If we look down in careless behavior and click this forward, we've got we can look for a number of more user behavior kinds of things, like, do I have somebody that looks like they're exfiltrating or staging a lot of data together? Are they downloading things from unapproved or unsecured sites? Can I spot things like accidental misconfigurations? And then if we build this out again and look at some unauthorized access cases, we could even look from an endpoint perspective with the insider threat management. Maybe you've got an administrator who's using SQL Server Studio or PHP MyAdmin to configure a MySQL database. You could see that in there. You could see people accessing, doing Git clones and Git pulls from GitHub at unusual hours. So really the idea here is looking for a number of things around access. And if we build this out one more time, we'll see that I put together the top 20 alerts that we saw across our install base in 2020. And you can see that there's a number of things that boil up to the top that you would expect, particularly in a world where we now work from anywhere and data is everywhere. Things like exfiltrating files via web upload, obviously far and away number one. Connecting unsanctioned USBs. Well, everybody had to work from home. We now maybe have USB printers and USB storage and a number of things that we're connecting. So some of these are not really far to make the leap out of reality to try to figure out what's going on here. One other thing I wanted to share is with all this power around the information protection platform, we have the ability to really turn this into threat hunting for data loss prevention scenarios or insider threat investigations. Proofpoint has this concept of what we call explorations, which are really standing queries. So I put a couple in the screenshot here, looking at people that might be on that 2-week notice of people who might be departing and looking at some of the activities they take. Perhaps we have our crown jewels in a couple of cloud applications, maybe out in GitHub, in a source code repository. I want to see who's moving files into and out of there. I want to see what they're doing with that and really drill in. Another common case that we see a lot of is around PowerShell execution. Do I have standard users executing PowerShell, or do I have single user use of PowerShell? Those might be some interesting things to track on an ongoing basis, along with exploring the users visiting my cloud storage, and also looking at different types of data exfiltration to USB devices. Finally, we talked about the different types of users and the spectrum of users out there, particularly around your negligent users. There's a great opportunity to marry up your data loss prevention controls with security awareness. And Proofpoint security awareness training has a number of built-in modules that help support basic core data loss prevention training. So things like proper sensitive data handling use and sanctioned use of cloud applications and things like that are examples of some of the modules that we have in here. We also have a number of modules that are compliance specific. So certainly if you're a multinational organization and deal with citizens in the EU, you're familiar with GDPR, or citizens in the UK, you're familiar with the UK Data Protection Act. There's a number of those types of modules in there, along with a number of the US states are starting to pick up with privacy regulations of their own. Everybody is probably very familiar with CCPA from California, the California Consumer Privacy Act. I know Virginia, within the last couple of weeks, recently passed their consumer data protection law. So we have a number of those pre-built compliance-specific training modules and even privacy-centric training modules in there that might be helpful and can also be used as a remediation point specifically for those negligent users. And finally, I want to wrap up with this notion that there's no one single vendor out there in the security landscape that can do everything. This is why having people-centric integrations with other technologies in the environment and helping users create their own security platform and their own cohesive security ecosystem is so important. Again, no one single vendor can do it all. You can't just go to a specific vendor and buy everything and do it all from them. And the idea around working with different security vendors is your strategy should not be focused on vendor consolidation. It should really be focused on vendor optimization. How can I get two separate companies, two separate technologies I work with? How can I get those optimized where I can make 1 + 1 = something more than 2? And we've got a number of those different integrations and building more and more every day. So particularly on the threat side with Palo Alto and CrowdStrike, utilizing and sharing information between Wildfire and between CrowdStrike's endpoint malware detection and prevention system. Certainly Okta on the identity management front. And on the privileged access management side, CyberArk and SailPoint to really help govern access for our very attacked people and specifically our privileged attacked people. From a SIM standpoint, we've got a number of Splunk apps that tie in with Proofpoint technology, specifically things like targeted attack protection and many of our other technologies out there. But we also have a very wide open API for that unified alert management console that I showed you earlier. We can take those activities that we're seeing from there. We can take all that information. Our unified alert management is really just built on top of our own API. And we expose those APIs so that if you've got a SIM or you've got a SOC function or you've even got a custom written SOC, we can take alerts and events and export those and make those successful for you. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. I hope this was helpful and a useful primer for you to understand what Proofpoint is doing on the front of information protection. Rich, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, Brian, for another great presentation. Folks, we are about out of time today, so we really cannot take any additional questions. But should you have questions, please give us a call at 844-FLYCAST. That's 844-359-2278. Or, once again, chat with us live during Monday through Friday normal business hours from 8:30 a.m. to 7:30 p.m. We're more than happy to get you data sheets, white papers, maybe a demo you might be looking for. Or email us at info@flycastpartners.com. It is very much appreciated that you have taken time out of your busy day to join us. So all those of you in attendance will receive a little something from Proofpoint after this today within the next 5 business days or so. And Brian, thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule to present for us. With that being said, everyone stay safe until our next broadcast.